and welcome to the VCE 20th Century podcast. We're now in Unit 2, looking at Area Study 1, Competing Ideologies. So in this unit, we're going to look at the latter half of the 20th century, so from 1945 to the year 2000. And our first area study we're going to look at is looking at competing ideologies. So we're going to look at the causes of the Cold War, some of the key characteristics of the ideologies of communism in the USSR and democracy and capitalism in the USA. And we're also going to look at the impact of the Cold War on nations, people, and finally looking at what led to the end of the Cold War. So in order to get a bit of context, we need to think about what happened beforehand, i.e. World War II. So we know that for millions of people, World War II had a significant impact on their lives. So if we think about 1945, it finally ended. People were sighing, having sighs of relief. Like, thank goodness that was over. That was one of the most brutal wars. Deaths, casualties were just unprecedented. We had a lot of civilians die in air raids during the battles. And obviously armed personnel were deceased during, submarine attacks. This was a war that was quite effective from the air. So we obviously had aviation advancements in technology. So the level of destruction compared to World War I was quite significant. So in countries that were occupied by German or Japanese forces, there were a lot of forced labour camps. There was a lot of starvation, disease. There was basically, as we've already studied, deliberate extermination of particular groups within society. We know in Japan there were prisoner of war camps, which were horrific. So we've got two things going on. We sort of have two theatres of war. We've got Europe and then we've got the Asia Pacific. So the Nazis obviously tried to exterminate the Jewish population of Europe, and that resulted in about 6 million deaths. And it became probably the most significant example of genocide in the 20th century. So the other thing that we also had was the level of destruction. So because we've got aeroplanes emerging as a really effective weapon of war, we've got factories, railways, communications can be easily shut down. Your factories, for example, for producing ammunition can be destroyed quite quickly. So there was also targeted use of bombings and things of civilian populations. Now, this was a fairly new development. In World War I, yes, there were civilian casualties, but in World War II, this, I suppose, sets almost like a trend in the 20th century, looking at what we now refer to as collateral damage. So it was also in Germany, we had some incredible air raids on Dresden, and there was a lot of, thousands of people died. So basically, we've gone from airborne, I suppose, warfare, and then we get into the nuclear age. So we have the first atomic bomb that's dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, and that happens in 1945 in August, and it ends the war in the Pacific. So we know that the European theatre has come to an end, but Japan kept fighting, and it was ended obviously with the advent of an atomic bomb. So there were a lot of technological developments that came with war, and things like radar, radios, echoes, different ways to calculate, distance and things like that made bombing targets a lot easier. And particularly German submarines, they were easier, I suppose, to detect as time went on and with some advances. We also had German submarines or U-boats, and there was a lot of technological advancement, and that actually led then to civilian applications. So, for example, microwaves, air traffic control, computers, that sort of thing. So we also then had long-range rockets, jet engines, and these things, while they were sort of at the end of the war, at the early stage of development, by the 60s, these things were part of everyday life. We also had advances in medical science, which again, during the war, you obviously have injured people. You need to be able to fix people up quite quickly. So surgical techniques and things like that, ways of dealing with death, injury, advanced. Obviously, we had, people who were able to be fixed, I suppose, with penicillin and immunisations and that sort of thing. Okay, so we also had, if you have a look at the statistics, the casualties then were cut by about 15%, particularly British and American troops, and also things like plastic surgery to, help with burns and that sort of thing were developed. Okay, so we also saw after the Second World War huge movements of people. So in Europe, you effectively had nowhere to go. We had people who had come back to their houses destroyed, the communities gone. People who were liberated from concentration camps, for example, came back to find that there was nothing left. So for a lot of people, basically going to another country became a better option. And as we know, in Australia, we had a lot of post-war migration to Australia, which boosted our population. There was the old adage, populate or perish, and we welcomed a lot of people who basically had nowhere to go. So we also had some economic impacts, obviously, of World War II. Britain was basically broke. The Australian economy had been really geared towards a war footing, and so we had lots of factories and farms and things like that sort of working overtime, if you like. We also had women working to sort of take up those positions, and obviously when blokes came back, they wanted their job back, and then, as we'll see, women got a bit cranky about that later on. And then we also had Soviet forces who had become a bit of a presence and a power, some developed power, obviously, because they had come in from the east and had been a pivotal ally in defeating Germany. So we've got, I suppose, what we call a bipolar world happening. We have the East and the West, and after the war, basically, America was in a better financial position than most European powers. So prior to that, you probably argue that Europe was the dominant world power, particularly with Britain. After that, it totally changed. America and the USSR became the two dominant superpowers. So after that, we have obviously the divvying up of Allied territory, who's going to get what, and we'll have a look at that a little bit later on. So really what we're looking at in this area of study is the long-term consequences of the Second World War. It was able to redefine the world. Geopolitically, the world was reconstructed. And we also have two ideologies which created sort of another conflict, if you like, that being communism versus capitalism. And those two things would lead and influence further conflicts, whether they be overt or covert wars. All right, so next time we'll have a bit of a look at where Europe was at in 1945 and how all of the lovely territory was divvied up and how that influenced the rest of the 20th century.